Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here today. My name is Terry Pecars, and I'm the Municipal Utilities Director for the City of Tempe. If you're not aware, Municipal Utilities is responsible for the management of the Water Utilities Division and the Field Operations Division, which is Solid Waste and Fleet Services. Water utilities is obviously combined water and wastewater utilities, all aspects of that service. So we're a rather large department, but we're here today to talk about and have your participation in the 2020 water and wastewater rate study. And we very much appreciate you being here today. I'm going to run through introductions of everyone just for ease of everyone's introduction. Would be very difficult if we went around the room. As you can tell, this is going to be a little bit clunky initially, but we appreciate you bearing with us, and we believe this will be a very productive and beneficial process for all involved. So let me go through the specifics of that, and then I will talk a little bit about the stakeholder group, why we're here today, and what we're hoping to accomplish before we get into the actual presentation. So with us today from the City of Tempe, and you've all been introduced to Steve White, either on this call or via email, maybe text message and invitations. Steve is our Planning and Research Analyst for Municipal Utilities. We also have Tara Ford. Tara is Deputy Municipal Utilities Director over our Water Utilities Division. Also on the call is Amanda McKeever. She's a Deputy Municipal Utilities Director over Field Operations. Tarya Namela is our Customer Services Manager. I think she may not be on the call yet, but she will be, and she'll be part of this group as well. We have Mary Fowler. She's a Senior Management Assistant with Municipal Utilities. Laura Kafitz is our Neighborhood Services Specialist, as is Brenda Clark. They'll both be on this group as well. And I'll run quickly through the stakeholders for the good of the group, and I'll also talk about that the stakeholders that we've invited are representative of various different customer classifications within our rate structure, if you will. So let me just introduce for all that are here. Carmen, and I apologize in advance for any mispronunciation of last names. As we were talking about earlier, my last name is Pecars, so I'll accept almost any version of that because I've heard various versions my whole life. But we have Carmen Umares, and Carmen is representing our single family group. Delia Story, also single family from North Tempe. Bob Kawa, Corona del Sol Estates, single family, South Tempe. Julianne Wheeler, Sunburst Farms HOA, single family, South Tempe. Cassandra Olmsted, single family, also South Tempe. We have Ann Gill, President and CEO of the Tempe Chamber of Commerce, representing commercial. Stacy Renfro, SES Manager, representing commercial with Coca-Cola. We have Steve Baxley, Vice President of Operations, also representing commercial industrial, United Dairymen. We have Phil Plensis, Director FDM Business Operations, and also representing commercial industrial for ASU. And we have Chastity Villaverde, representing multifamily class, La Estancia Apartments. So that's the group that we have here today, or mostly here today, which we will have ultimately. Again, we'd like to thank all of you for your time and participation in this process. As most of you know, Tempe is very committed to public involvement and public input on policy decisions and decision-making processes. Historically, we've sought this feedback and input via public meetings and public hearings and communications efforts primarily. But this year, amid all of the changes and all of the experience we're all going through with COVID and various other reasons, we thought it would be a good idea to maybe look at a slightly different way of getting that input, and that being a stakeholder group that's representative of the various customer classes across our utility billing system and how we bill for water services. We will also, of course, do public meetings and communications, and we will do all the sort of normal outreach efforts that we do in terms of transparency of process and how we share information with all of our customers and the community. But this is an additional effort to not only receive your input and feedback, but help you to also understand the process and what it takes to have the cost of doing business recovered when we collect rates, and making those kinds of difficult decisions sometimes as to whether we want to change, adjust, modify, or otherwise do anything with our rate structure, and how that's going to affect our community and our customers. So the other thing I wanted to mention was that our consultant, we have a consultant that helps us with this process, Stantec. And Stantec has been working with the city of Tempe for several years now, since 2015. They've helped us to complete several rate studies, cost of service studies, both in the water utilities area, but also in our solid waste function. And the Stantec team is led by Andrew Burnham, and Andy is a vice president and director of financial management consulting. And also on the team are senior consultants Kyle Stevens and Deborah Klockner. And in a few minutes, I'll turn it over to Andy to start with the presentation, but I just wanted to remind everyone, as Steve mentioned previously, that we are recording these sessions because we will be sharing them with others, not only the stakeholders that are absent or for some other reason cannot attend the entire meeting, but also so we have a record of the feedback that's given, the questions that are asked, and that sort of thing, so we can review them moving forward, so we can address those kind of questions. So if I believe I covered everything that I wanted to cover. Tara, would you like to say a few words before we turn it over to Andy?
Yeah, just, oh, excuse me, sorry about that. Yes, just very briefly, I just want to thank everyone for participating in this process, and to say that I do look forward to working with everyone. I've been in this position now for probably 6 months. So I'm very much looking forward to this process and working with a lot of you to get your feedback and input. And I know that Terry pretty much covered everything. So at any time, if anyone needs anything, they can reach out to myself or Terry. Thank you.
Thanks, Tara. And with that, if there aren't any initial questions for me or Tara, I will turn it over to Andy and we'll get started on the presentation. But thank you again for being here.
All right, well, hearing no questions, this is Andy Burnham with Stantec. What myself, Kyle, and Deb were hoping to do today was to run through a slide deck presentation that we put together that's kind of an orientation to water and sewer utility rate making, some industry perspective, the general process, as well as some information about the city's rates and customer information. But I think first and foremost, we wanted to make sure that we started this process with a very good understanding of what Terry was saying about participation and education, and that's really starts in large part today. So, as I mentioned, we'll be going through today and introducing some industry challenges, discussion around infrastructure as it relates to water resources, talking about how services are provided, and try to avoid using acronyms as much as we can, but when they do come up, try to make sure that we provide a proper description of what those terms are. And we're hoping to get as much as we can through either chat or verbal questions, get some input from each one of you as we embark upon the process, and that really starts today, whether there's key questions that you have that you'd like to have answered, provide input on certain priorities for capital spending or levels of service, or concerns about rate structures. Those are the types of things that we really want to elicit from this process as well. So we hope that we're starting a good two-way communication today, and we look to both distribute information, but really receive and hear your concerns and input to be able to factor it into the process. So if you go to the next slide, really for today, I was just going to give a quick overview about Stantec and the water industry and the rate study process, and then turn it over to Kyle to go through kind of each of the fundamental steps of the rate setting process, as he'll be the project manager for this year's rate study for Tempe, and to give some examples along the way to really help illustrate what we're talking about, and then kind of close the loop again with about what our next schedule and opportunities are for continued conversations with this group as we continue to move throughout the process. So just a bit about Stantec. As Terry mentioned, we've been working with the city for a few years, and Stantec does a great many things with over 22,000 employees across the globe. But Kyle, Deb, and I are a part of a financial services group that is very specialized. We work with over 300 communities across the country on utility financial management issues. We do about 150 to 200 financial planning, cost of service, and rate studies per year for all the communities that we serve. There's about 35 of us that are really dedicated to that specific focus area. And so we offer a significant number of years, but also a diversity of experiences working with communities across the country that really allow us to bring not only industry best practices, but also practices that we've observed to address issues across the country to the communities that we work with. So it's a very robust process where we bring together the best of what we have to offer and our collective experiences to help address sustainability for the communities that we work with in their utility systems. One of the important perspectives to have relative to water resources is an understanding that costs can differ significantly, not only when you look just locally in your area, but if you take a step back first and look at across the nation. This is a snapshot from an industry group, the Circle of Blue, that every few years they'll go out and do some surveying of water, sewer, and stormwater costs for some key communities. I don't know why they neglected to put Tempe on this list, so Kyle went ahead and added them to the list. You can see with a little bit different shading so it stands out. But I think some perspective like this is important. You look at communities that are really struggling with infrastructure issues such as Atlanta, or water resource constraints such as in the Southeast or in California, or fundamental challenges associated with water resource restrictions such as in Texas. To have a bit of perspective, I think is helpful in mind as we enter into this conversation, that the Southwest is generally one of the lower cost areas for water and sewer costs across the country. But all these utilities do have a common denominator in that many of the challenges that they face relative to aging infrastructure, increasing regulatory requirements, operational cost inflation, and changes in customer use behaviors are really causing upward pressure on their rates to be able to continue to provide a high level of service in the face of those pressures. And so that leads utility systems, regardless of where they're starting at, in a position where they're looking at increases in costs, generally speaking, from year to year that outpace overall inflation. And so when you think about the United States Consumer Price Index that's maintained by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the basket of goods in that Consumer Price Index is about 190 different goods and services, ranging from healthcare to insurance to housing costs to clothing to food to apparel, a great number of different things. And that basket of goods for a household generally increases, you can see between 0 to maybe 3% per year. I think many folks on average would equate inflation to being about 2 to 3% per year. But for a utility system, because of all those constraints that I mentioned, when you just isolate the cost of water and sewer service to households and assume the same usage each year that the CPI does, the average annual increase in water and sewer rates across the country is generally ranging from about 4 to 7% per year. So on average, it's about 2 to 3 times the rate of overall inflation to all of our expenses that we see at a household level. And so I think having some of that context is important to understand that, we are in an area of the country that we have a lower starting point, but many of the cost pressures that all utilities see are also present here in Tempe that we'll have to take into account as we embark upon our financial planning process to make sure that we can provide sustainable, high quality drinking water and also protect the environment and dispose of our effluent requirements from wastewater responsibly. Is going to take a focus on our costs and ultimately is going to have potential rate impacts going forward to keep up with those costs. So if you really boil down the local comparison, things get even more complex in terms of not only understanding what we have to cover from an expenditure requirement from rates, but the vast array of options that we have to structure our rates in a combination of fees that are maybe fixed on a monthly basis based on meter size, or costs that are variable based on how much water a household or a business were to use, can vary dramatically, and even very dramatically in a very small geographic area. So if you look locally around the area, you can see a variety of structures are used to capture the cost of providing, in this case, water service from the community. Common rate structure is the use of inclining block rate structure, such as what Tempe has and also what Chandler, Evandale, and Gilbert have, which is for higher levels of water use, the price increases, reflecting a higher cost associated with meeting those peak water supplies, and also provides an incentive for water conservation at those higher levels of usage. But then you can see other communities, say Albuquerque, New Mexico, that has actually a surcharge that's at 1.5 times their volume for their second tier rate. Or if you look at, say, Phoenix, that has a seasonal rate structure where the rate's different in the winter months versus the summer months versus the spring and fall. So it gets really complicated when we start working our way through the process of understanding how much money we have to cover to provide our level of service. And then how do we go through the process of distributing those costs to our customer classes and recovering them? It's going to be a very complex process. So we really look to try to break that down as much as we can through conversations like this to give a general overview, but then focus on the specific elements of a rate study and how we get from the very beginning to the very end in a measured approach so that we can have specific conversations that allow us to focus on a specific subset of issues. So if you go to the next slide, the way that we do that is really kind of a three-step process. First, determining how much money that we need to have, which we often call a revenue sufficiency analysis, evaluating the adequacy of the revenue provided by our current rates to cover our current and projected operating and capital cost requirements, and to make sure that we have adequate liquidity and reserves as part of that forecast. The second step is how do we allocate that revenue requirement to our customer classes? How do we group customers based upon like usage characteristics and service characteristics to make sure that we have a fair distribution of that amount of money that we need to collect to provide our service? And how do we charge and how do we recover those costs from our customer classes in a series of fixed and variable charges? And at the end of the process, have a very clear understanding of what are the impacts of potential alternatives in rate structure and what are the impacts to customer bills for all customer classes. And so we try to break down the conversation, and we'll have subsequent meetings where we focus very specifically on each of these elements of the rate study process. How much, from whom, and how do we collect it? But today what we wanted to do is go through a little bit of an overview to give you a sense of what to expect in our conversations about revenue sufficiency, cost allocation, and ultimately rate design. And so with that bit of an overview, that's where we wanted to pivot to next, was to start breaking down those three key elements of the process to give you a little bit better understanding of what goes into them and what will be coming back to you to talk about, to gather your input and to look at alternatives and to address policies and key issues and concerns.
Perfect, thank you, Andy. I'll jump in and take us right into the revenue requirements. With regards to the revenue requirements, what we're really concerned with in the simplest terms is understanding the cost of running the system from an annual basis. And I put up here this graphic that illustrates some of the items that go into that make up the total amount of money that we need, and we typically refer to that as a revenue requirement. So we've got things like O&M, operations and maintenance, reserves, capital investments are a big one that come up from year to year, and those are the big infrastructure pipes and plants that we need to put in to deliver water or take wastewater from customers. There's a couple of unique ones as well. Tempe, with its location in Arizona, relies on the Central Arizona Project for some of its water, which is commonly referred to as CAF. This is the water that's transmitted from the Colorado River over. So that's a unique operating requirement that the water system has. On the wastewater system, Tempe is part of a sub-regional operating group, which essentially it sends some of its wastewater flows or all of its wastewater flows to the 91st Avenue treatment plant that Phoenix runs. And That is a cost on the wastewater side that we need to incorporate into the annual revenue requirement for the system. This little graphic right here, I just wanted to break out and show graphically what are some of the big components and put some dollars to it. So kind of the cost to fill a glass of water in FY20. On the water system, it's roughly, we've got some debt of about $21 million annually a year that we're repaying. We've got capital investments that we're funding at roughly $21 million and operating expenses of $32 million on an annual basis. We take the wastewater system, kind of the cost to drain a tub, if you will. We've got debt of $15 million, capital investments of $16 million we're making, and operating expenses of $14 million on an annual basis. So what do we do with this information? And this is something we'll be bringing back in some of our meetings that will be coming. This is a screenshot of our financial models, and what we do here is we take all of those great data points that I just talked through, typically come from the city, work with the city to incorporate them into a 10-year projection, a cash flow model, if you will, so that we can understand the dynamics that are present not only in the current budget year, but also moving forward into the future. And that way we can anticipate things that are coming, and ultimately, the goal here is to ensure that the amount of revenue that we're bringing in provides for the sustainable operations of the system. And so I'll just orient you to a few of the key graphics. And this is a screenshot from our last full rate study in 17. When we get together at our next meeting, we're going to have the updated model and projections for the revenue needs of the system. So this is the water fund, and a couple of the things we're always watching. So over here's the operating fund, and this is just very much like your own bank account. This is the amount of money we have in the bank. And over here is the amount of money we're spending in orange versus black, how much money is coming in the door. And so you can see in this particular case, got a little bit of a gap from those two, meaning we spend a little bit more in some years than we bring in. And just as you would imagine with your own bank account, that would pull down the fund balances. In addition, you can see up here in this top line, what we had projected back in 2017 is that the water utility would need about 4.25% rate increases. And so we had identified at that point in time that you would need some level of rate increases to continue to provide for the system. And as we update this and get all of the updated financial requirements in, we'll want to compare back to this plan to see what's changed from 2017 and identify what this new level of increases would need to be going into the future. In regards to the wastewater system, we've got a separate model that contains all of its cost requirements distinct from water. And with regards to sewer and the model that we updated in 2017, what you can see here is we had a more stable outlook. So in the case of sewer, the current revenues were providing a very sustainable system for the full projection period. And back in 17, we had anticipated no rate increases for the forecast period. And with that, you can see our operating fund balances were very much above our target here as identified in black. So we were in a sustainable period over the long term. So again, we'll want to compare, and we'll have a contrasting view when we pull this up next time from the 17 forecast to the most current models, which include all of the updated assumptions and updated cost requirements. One of the things to notice on here, and we'll talk about this in detail as we get into the next one, on this bottom chart is our CIP. And I mentioned a second ago that that's one of the more dynamic features of utilities. When they're providing operations, we have to ensure that we're bringing into the fold the continued renewal and investment spending in the system, so the pipes aren't breaking and so that we have a system that's sustainable. But in addition, there's a number of needs that come to the system, and the needs can vary year by year. And so if I take this graphic over the left, you can just see how the needs and the CIP spending can vary a little bit. And we had expected when we updated this, they would actually increase in the out years of this projection. And so this will be something that will continue to drive our understanding and our projections in the future as one of the larger and more variable components of forecasting utility rates. So with that, what we thought would be a good idea is, as we go through these identified components, the revenue requirement, the cost of service, and the rate design, we take a little bit of a break here, and instead of talking completely through it, take some of your questions or discussion to make this more interactive. And so what I'd like to do is if anyone has any questions, feel free to talk, or if you want to use the chat window, we can use that. And we'd be more than happy to answer any of your questions on the revenue requirements before we go ahead and jump into the cost of service.
Hi, Kyle. This is Steve White. I was just reading a message that Carmen had posted on the chat, and the question was, why do we have more expenses than income? Isn't that supposed to result in bankruptcy? And I think that goes back to what our fund balance is. So
Yeah.
I'll let you.
Yeah, no, that's an absolute great question. And so fundamentally what we're doing here over a long-term period is trying to manage our reserve balances. And let me get my laser pointer back up here and I can show you exactly the conversation that as we update this next time, we'll want to be looking at. And so in this particular case, what we've identified here is a minimum target that we would like to hold in the utility funds, which is this black line right here. And what that really represents is an amount of fund balance that we would not like to go below. And that's mainly because we have ongoing expenses that we would like to protect against in case they were, we had an unplanned failure or just overall liquidity. It typically takes 3 months to bill customers. By the time they use the service, you have a bill and then you get payment for it. And so it's very common for utilities to hold some balances in their bank account to protect against unforeseen circumstances. In the case of Tempe, when we've updated this model, what you notice is it's a little bit above the target in this beginning period. And so this plan was crafted in order to spend down some of those balances over a multi-year period, but being very cognizant of the fact that as we spend those down, we're creating this gap between cash out and cash in, which are absolutely right in the long term is unsustainable. But with the 4.25 plan, what we're trying to do is maintain in the very out years here, those expenses and incomes on top of each other. So we do have a sustainable plan, and we've been able to get those reserve balances in alignment with the designated target we have for the utility funds.
And Kyle, one thing, if I could, this is Andy, to add to that is, with utility systems, it's not uncommon to make set-asides of funds in anticipation of future capital outlays because of just how intensive water utilities are from a capital investment perspective. It's prudent to make annual set-asides for future capital investments, and then as those investments occur, you can then draw upon those reserve funds to make the payment for those capital expenses. And so that's kind of an important dynamic that you'll see that their utilities will have at some points in their time period, cash reserves that they can draw on for planned capital expenses intentionally, but that fundamentally, back to Kyle's top center chart of revenues and expenses, from an income perspective, that's why we always want to make sure that that cash in, the black line, is also above that O&M line, the operations and maintenance expenses. That's the core operating expenses of the utility. So that's why we track total cash out in orange, which includes capital, but then also just what are our annual operating costs to, quote, keep the lights on, so that we can make sure we have that as well as our debt payments covered.
Andy, we have a question from Bob Kawa. He says, how would you describe the condition of the water and sewer system?
So I may, from a financial standpoint, I can certainly answer that question. I would say from a financial standpoint, the condition of the water and sewer systems is actually quite positive. The reserve trajectory, or the reserves, are adequate. They've got some good flexibility that allows us to continue to make sure our income streams are in close alignments with our expenditure profiles over time. Particularly on the sewer side, it seems like we're in a very good position there as well. So as compared to other utility systems across the country, where you have this type of a stable outlook for sewer and a pretty moderate outlook for the water system, I would say from a financial condition standpoint, it's very positive. But perhaps maybe Terry or Tara could maybe, from a physical standpoint, describe their perspective of the physical system or physical condition of the system.
Yeah, this is Terry. Bob, thanks for that question. From a physical condition of the infrastructure, like was described previously with most other water utilities, we have an aging infrastructure, as you probably know, and we've got all the challenges associated with the timing of infrastructure replacement, but also investment in new infrastructure. I would say, generally speaking, our system is in good condition. We are very proactive in terms of assessing conditions from an engineering standpoint, planning for replacement, planning for repairs and preventative maintenance and that sort of thing. But the challenge is, as we move forward, Tempe, there's many other aspects to being able to accomplish certain types of infrastructure replacement work that we have to face, and it ends up having an effect on timing and such, as you can imagine, with development and not impacting customers negatively, but still being able to achieve the goals relative to our capital improvement and capital replacement program. So generally speaking, I'd say we're in good condition. Our facilities are in good condition. Our buried infrastructure is in good condition, but we have to be cognizant of the replacement needs and our maintenance programs moving forward. So I hope that answers your question.
We have another question from Carmen. She asks, in the last 2 to 3 years, has the debt gone up or down, and how much is that debt?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to answer that. So as you can see on this chart, and I'll get my laser pointer back out, one of the elements that we use to fund the capital system in Tempe is debt. So in red here is the debt financing that we're forecasting in the future for capital. And so basically we've got big capital items or big ticket items. They have a really long life as well, which is a key dynamic of them. And when we're investing those, they may last 30, 40, and 50 years in some cases with this infrastructure. And so one of the ways that utilities will pay for it is using debt to spread that cost out and have the repayment over a number of years, which helps us better align the benefits of that infrastructure with the ratepayers today and also in the future that'll benefit. And so the debt has increased each and every year that we've done capital improvements. But I think from a financial perspective, the debt is not anything that we've necessarily been concerned with as far as it being too high for these utility systems. But it's something we track, and it is a key performance indicator for both of these funds on an ongoing basis. And I'd have to get the exact numbers, Steve. Maybe I can follow up with the exact numbers. I wouldn't want to talk out of order if I don't have the exact one in front of me.
Understood, Kyle, and we'll provide those numbers for Carmen. And thanks, Terry and Andy, for your previous response. Bob has responded, yes, you answered his question. And I would just also echo what Kyle was saying, that as we incur more debt, we're also retiring debt. So there is quite a bit of balance there with retired debt from bonds that we're paying off every single year versus new bonds that we are issuing. So, but we'll get that information out.
Yeah, Steve, I was just going to make that very same point. You know, on the slide that Kyle has up for sewer, you can see that exact dynamic play out on the expenses by type. Even though we're issuing more debt over this forecast period, we are paying off some of the existing debt at the same time. So you can see that the thickness of that red bar stays generally consistent over the time period. So we're not incrementally adding a substantial amount of additional debt service or principal and interest repayment requirements above what we're paying off. So we're kind of maintaining a pretty steady level of annual principal and interest requirements over the forecast period.
Bob has just asked another question. Does development pay for itself, or is it subsidized by the community?
It's a great question. So within these models, we have projected that as new development comes online, they would pay the applicable system development fees, which are essentially the fees that a new connection to the system pays based on their expected capacity usage of the system. And so to that degree, each new account that's brand new to the system would pay into this and would pay towards some of that capital that they would use. And then, of course, once they're hooked in, they would pay the ongoing operational rates that everyone is subject to that's connected to the system and using water.
And Carmen has also asked a question. Debt limits is in debt limit in something to make investments in water systems. I'm sorry, I don't understand the question. Debts limit us in something to make investments in water system. I guess, oh, Brenda's revising the question. Hang on one second. We'll get clarification. My interpretation is are there any debt limits that are limiting our ability to make investments in the water system? But based on what I can see, but Carmen said yes, that's correct.
So generally, when we look at the debt instruments for water resource utilities, it depends on the type of financing. So the city has utilized different types of debt with different pledges of revenue sources to repay that debt, with the ultimate source of funds to repay any and all of those debts being the utility rates. So really, debt doesn't necessarily limit us, or in this case, have any additional constraints upon us, other than we just have to continue to plan and set our rates to be sufficient to cover our operating expenses and the principal and interest expenses on that debt, in addition to being able to cash fund a certain amount of future investments. So it really doesn't limit us in our ability to make future investments. We just have to plan on the repayments for that debt as we look ahead over a 3, 5, and 10-year forecast period.
Thank you, Andy. I don't see any further chat questions.
Perfect. Then we'll move on to the next section, and we'll go through cost of service. And cost of service is fundamentally concerned with trying to understand that identified revenue requirement we just talked about in the last section, how to split that up between customer classes and create this rational nexus between the cost of the system and the people who are using it, and we want to try to best align those. So this first graphic I popped up on the screen is something unique to Tempe, and it's the fact that the city has invested in a next generation of technology, being automated metering infrastructure. And all this simply means is that the meters have been upgraded over the last, I think, year or two in order to provide more data, greater intervals in the data collection. And so what I've got up on here is just an example. And when we get to the real cost of service analysis we're going to provide as part of this rate study, we're going to be taking a really deep dive into customer data and trying to understand the different ways that different customers utilize your system. I thought maybe what would be interesting to this group today is I've already processed some of this data, and one of the things that we've been working through is trying to understand the current reality on the ground that we're in with specificity with COVID and how that impacts the water utility. And so up here in the top, what I've got in gray is the volumetric trends starting on the left from the first of the year all the way through the first week in May. And in orange is the trends this year. And so on residential, the kind of interesting data points that come out of this says we're pretty much in alignment on single family usage. You can see kind of an upward trend as you head into the summer and you get more irrigation demands. But overall, these 2 years look very close to one another. On commercial, down on the bottom, I've got the black baseline year and then in orange, the current year. As you might imagine, if we go through about half of this graphic and we get to March, you can see a real divergence in the volumetric trends. And so with the commercial closures and just general restrictions on movements of people, we've seen some of that volume decline, as well as I would suppose ASU being closed and some classes there for the end of the spring semester would likely have an impact there as well. And so just, again, some of this data that we can bring in that we now have available for this study for the first time will really help us understand the different trends that are occurring within your service area and be able to incorporate these into the analysis so we can best align those costs with the customers that are incurring them on the system. How do we go about doing that? And the main way that practitioners in rate studies go about breaking up the cost is a by-the-book approach. The book is M1. It's an industry manual that defines how you cut up or proportion the cost to then connect them back to customer usage characteristics. And so what we're really talking about in simple terms here is the functions, first and foremost, that the utility provides. So the example here on the screen is water. And what we're concerned with is breaking up first and foremost. You can kind of think about this in the sense of how a drop of water moves through the system. And so on the left side of the screen, we've got the first step in the process, which is raw water pumping, raw water transport, raw water storage, and then moving into the treatment component where water is finished, disinfectants sometimes are added to it, and then next it's moved to the piping system. And so the first step in the piping system is what we call transmission, and that's typically the larger diameter pipes that are moving water around the community. And then next it moves to the distribution system, which are typically the pipes you could think of in front of a single family home. These are the smaller diameter pipes that are usually on the end of the system where they're delivering water to an end use in residential neighborhoods. And you've got pumping and storage associated with this as well. And then finally, we've got some other functions that aren't directly associated with moving water, but rather these are some administrative functions. So customer service, billing, meter reading. These are some other functions that we'll want to pull those costs out very specifically, mainly because they don't scale or they don't change from customer to customer like usage does. And so by putting those in their own silo, we can better connect those costs. And then down on the bottom, we have some industry jargon. Andy said we want to stay away from that, but there's some we just can't. And what this is the different ways we measure usage on the system. And so the first bucket you'll hear me talk about as we go into cost of services is average day demands, which is simply the kind of annual or daily average usage. The next is thinking about how customers peak our system. And so one of the cost dynamics that a water utility faces is peak demands on the system, meaning those maximum type demands that may arise only several times throughout the years, but the system has to be invested in and has to stand ready to meet those demands when they occur. And so the first type of demand that we measure is what we refer to as the maximum day demand. And then the next one is a peak hour demand. So thinking about within a day, well, those peak hours that may have really, really substantial use that our pipes have to be wide enough for and our pumps have to be strong enough for to provide when the customers need them. And then third is customer service cost. And so the allocation process is kind of a matrix to take those different functions and then layer them in to the categories of measurement based on the physical infrastructure or a direct allocation. And so you can see on this first one, a source of supply, that's 100% base capacity. And so the source of supply is really just a function of how much water the service area needs on an average basis. But when we start to move down the functional arrangement to the right here, and we talk about treatment, we start to see that the picture becomes, it has more elements to it. So for treatment, we're not only providing the average capacity, but treatment also has some investment in it to meet some of those maximum day demands. And if we move to transmission or distribution, we'll start to see additional demands that we're measuring that these assets are meant to meet. So for the distribution system, it is meeting not only the average, but maximum day and peak hour demands. And then finally, our customer cost is a simple mapping of customer cost to the customer function. What does this look like? I've just pulled in the numbers here from our last study, and we can see kind of the functional cost on top here, identified as part of a cost allocation where we essentially sit down with city staff and the people that know these expenses to the best, and we try to figure out how best to put these functions, the dollars, into functions by allocating those cost line items on a line-by-line basis, cost center by cost center, into each of these functions. And so you can see across the top here, we had a test year where the amount of money we needed was essentially $57 million in gross cost. And then through the functions, you can see how that splits out. We typically see treatment, transmission, distribution as some of the larger cost of the system. And then down below, you can see how those costs, the same cost in total, get mapped back to average day, max day, peak hour, and customer cost. And this will become clear how we'll use this in the next section, but essentially we're really concentrating on identifying those costs and ensuring they get into the correct bucket. Now, how do we measure customer usage? Now that we have buckets or functions, what we want to understand are the different ways that we can look at customer usage. And so what I've done here off to the left is pulled on the table from the last time we did a deep dive on these statistics. And here are the customer types off to the left. So for water, there are 6 customer classes that are identified, and each one of them has unique characteristics. And so if I just kind of go through this, the number of bills issued throughout the year, you can see the totals here. That might be something that's really relevant when we think of customer service cost. It's the proportion of bills being issued or customers being served in each of these. If we move to the left here, we can now see the units of measurement related to some of these demands placed on the system. So the first one being the daily demand or the average demand. This is reflective of the overall needs of these customer classes on an annual basis. When we move to the right, though, what we're really looking at is incremental needs above those average needs for a max day, that peak time, typically in the summer where we've got a lot of seasonal usage that comes on the system that can lead to higher demands. And then additionally, to the right, we also can look at the system, and I'm really excited this year to have the AMI data to really help us drill into customer usage on the hourly basis to understand in these customer classes where these demands are coming from, which helps us best connect the cost of the system back to these customer classes, ensuring that we're collecting that revenue that we need to the people that are having us incur the cost to provide service. Down on the bottom here, I've just put together a couple graphics, and you can see on this one, just to highlight some of the differences in the way that customers use the system. This one shows in blue here, it's kind of single family in the blue color, kind of represents 76% of all bills issued. So they're a big customer class, number of customers and bills. You know, when we talk about volume, for instance, they're only 30% of the average volume. And so depending on how we measure a customer's class's usage, it can be a very different story of who's actually using these demands. And we'll want to know all of those statistics as we try to connect it back to the underlying cost of the utility. So how does this sum up at the end of the day? What we like to do is, and this is the ending kind of answer for cost of service, is what we've got here is what was shown from the 2017 study, which in gray is our current rate revenue by customer class here on the x-axis, and then in orange, this is the rate requirement. So this is as we've done a study and allocated cost, what is the true cost to serve this customer class? And oftentimes when we do this, we will identify differentials in the cost to serve customers. And so if we look at this first case, back in the 2017 study, we had identified just a small variance between the current revenue and residential and the current cost to serve. And you can see as we go through different customer classes, this multifamily had a similar dynamic where it was revenue was slightly lower than current cost. Commercial was the same. This helps us identify where we might need to make changes in the future to where revenue is coming from. Yeah, I think the other thing to mention here is the city of Tempe is really proactive in doing this analysis. So the fact that they did it in 15, 17, and again this year, oftentimes when we go through this, the gaps are relatively small. In other communities that may take a lot longer time before they do these types of analysis, these differentials can get much larger. And so that's just something as we've gone through the process, we've noticed this be a pretty level process of just identifying differences in the usage and cost from year to year as we update this analysis. And so with that, I'll stop on the cost of service again. Let's take any questions, any discussion on that, and then we'll move over to rate design.
Kyle Julianne has a question through chat. Let me read it off here. Tempe has a significant number of agricultural properties. that use is not broken out separately. Those properties are treated as single-family uses and penalized for water usage, even though the acreage is the equivalent of that used by several single-family homes. It seems appropriate to make adjustments, as those owners, myself included, are often paying very high property tax rates as well. And I think we're going to get into this a little bit later in the presentation, so you might want to address that later, but you can, I'll just send it over to you.
Yeah, I think, Steve, this is Andy. I think one thing on that, you know, rate design would be a good place to maybe elaborate on it, but this is a good opportunity as we go through cost of service, that to the extent that, you know, we can and there's interest to look at additional customer classes to the extent we have the data. You know, we can look at the usage characteristics and configurations and see if, from a cost of service standpoint, it's appropriate to have a different customer class. So a good example would be in Bismarck, North Dakota. They were very interested in looking at some institutional categories for hospitals and government facilities as a separate rate classification, in addition to churches. And so we were able to work with the community to flag those accounts into the system, to understand who they were, and then did an analysis of their usage requirements to see, you know, should they in fact be treated differently from a customer classification standpoint because their usage characteristics and service characteristics were different. So notwithstanding the pricing element of that question that we'll get to in a minute, you know, there is the ability, to the extent we have the data, to look at creating or consolidating customer classifications as part of this process. So this may be something, back to you, Steve, that relative to agricultural properties, to the extent we can identify them in your billing system, you know, from a cost of service standpoint, it's certainly something that we could look at as part of this study.
That's a good point, Andy, and that is something, not specifically agricultural properties, but lot size was certainly something we incorporated into our 2017 study, but we did stop at, I believe it was 16,000 square feet. So certainly a good discussion point, and a lot of those agricultural properties, some of them have flood irrigation, some don't have flood irrigation, but now that we have AMI, we do have a better sense of usage. But we would need land use and do some other analysis there to get a little bit more granular and identify agricultural versus non-agricultural. So certainly it's something we can look into. Another question from Bob Kawa: has the automated meters decreased the cost to customers? And I can tackle that one. It certainly doesn't decrease the cost to customers. However, it does provide each customer the ability to manage their own water use through the WaterSmart portal, and obviously fix leaks and respond to higher than normal water use. All of that's in each customer's control now. However, the cost of our system doesn't go down just because we have AMI. It just provides us with more data and analytics to understand customer trends and be more precise with our cost of service analysis and so forth. Hopefully that answered your question, Bob. Julie Ann, remember that we are paying these costs with after-tax dollars. These are not business expenses. And then one of the points that I think Julianne had made earlier was it seems appropriate to make adjustments, as those owners, myself included, are often paying very high property tax. So one point, and Andy, you can probably jump in here, is your property taxes and what those pay for versus cost recovered for your utility system. As an enterprise fund, rates have to cover the cost of providing water and wastewater service. A service is really not, we don't look at taxes and what goes to the general fund to provide other city services. We are a standalone operation, completely, wholly enterprise funded. So there is no subsidization, if you will, between what you pay in property taxes that go to the city versus what you pay in rates to receive water or wastewater service.
Yeah, just to pile on simply, Steve, I mean, really all the cost of water and sewer services are captured in water and sewer rates.
And one more question from Carmen. I didn't know that there would be a penalized for water usage. What is the limit of usage? There is no limit of usage. However, on the single family customer class, there's an inclining block rate structure, which I believe Andy and his team will get into next, which I think shows a higher cost for the more use. And we'll get into that shortly, and maybe we can go into that now.
Yeah, I'd be happy to, Steve. Are there any other questions, or that's the last one?
That's only chat one, and feel
Okay.
free to ask questions verbally too in the future if you have a mic.
Perfect. Yeah, let's jump into rate design, and we can cover the next topic. So with regards to rate design, this is really the last step in the process where the rubber meets the road, and we've identified how much cost we need, what customer classes should pay for it. This is really concerned with how do we structure the actual rates that we're going to charge to different customer classes. And there's a couple different components to it that I'd like to walk you through that we'll be talking through with this analysis. And so typically we think of this in kind of two different structures that come into play. So one is a fixed fee that's typically paid monthly regardless of usage. And those fixed fees help the utility do two things. One, they help stabilize some of the revenue stream. So we mentioned earlier when I showed you that AMI, this year's one of those strange years where volume declined and we couldn't have predict that. So fixed charges help us stabilize and ensure we've got some money coming in that's not completely dependent on usage, because if that usage disappears, we don't have the money to run the system. Additionally, fixed charges also can help us allocate costs more correctly to customers. As I mentioned, some costs like customer charges are not really dependent on usage from one customer or one customer class to the next. So oftentimes those types of costs are better recovered in a fixed monthly charge. Additionally, base charges, which reflect some readiness to serve, are very common in the industry. And this is part of the monthly charge that essentially scales by the meter size, but reflects what the potential usage on the system could be. Because one dynamic in the utility world is we have to always be there ready to serve a customer 24/7, 365 days a year, even if they're not necessarily pulling that water out of the system. So these charges help recover some of those fixed costs that a utility have, and the majority of costs in a utility are fixed. And then the second component are the volume charges. And so I'll go through a number of these slides and some of the thought process that goes into how do you construct volume charges for different customer classes to try to best align the way that we charge water and the price we put on it with the underlying usage characteristics. And a lot of it goes back to the similarness of customers within a customer class and our availability of data. As you heard us say, with this study, we're really excited about the fact that we have a new level of data that we haven't had in the past that's very much local and tied to your customers on the system. And so we're looking forward to being able to use that to refine the rates that are charged. We go through one item on the single family charge we just alluded to is the inclining block nature of it. And this first slide just talks about the pricing of it. And so I'll talk about how we got to the size in a second, but there are 5 tiers in place, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 on the x-axis. And then what I've shown here is the height, which is the price of those tiers that reflect as you go from one usage allotment up to the next, what the price per 1,000 gallons of water within a monthly period is. And the way that we've structured these rates is essentially back to that cost of service. We've identified the different usage components, being the base or average usage, the peak day and peak hour cost that occurs within each of these tiers. And so, for example, as we look at tier 1, a lot of this usage in tier 1, which is the first increment of usage, is very steady type demands throughout the year. But as we increase into the tiers that have higher usage allotments, what we find from the data is that there's additional peak demands being served on that, meaning that those volumes come on and peak the system. that represent some of that additional investment that we've made to serve those demands. And what we can see here is in tier 2, we see some peak day allocation of cost that adds into the unit pricing. When we get to tier 3, you'll see now we have peak hour cost and peak day as well as average. And then when we get to the 4th and 5th tier, we see higher usage of these peak demands. And so that cost has been allocated to those higher tiers and proportional to its usage. Now, with regards to other customer classes, I've got the other ones listed here to the left. And this was the previous rates that we had in 2016 and the current ones that were adopted after the 2017 study. And I think there's a couple characteristics here to think through with the other customer classes. It's very common in the water industry to charge these customer classes a flat volumetric rate per 1,000 gallons. And so, for example, in multifamily, that was $2.22 per 1,000 gallons. It was adjusted to $2.51 as a result of the 2017 study. And the reason that you would charge a flat rate to these customer classes is because there can be a very large differential between one customer to the next as far as usage is concerned. So we could think about, for example, in multifamily, a 10-unit apartment complex right next to a 200-unit apartment complex. That's going to have very significantly different demands placed on it. And so rate structures that have containment or different pricing, it's very hard to price unless we know the demand drivers are and are able to incorporate them into a rate structure. And so typically these rate structures recognize some of those differences we see in commercial, industrial, landscaping needs from one customer to the next. The change that we will see between these really fundamentally reflects the cost of service analysis we just went through to ensure that in total, these customers are paying their fair share of system costs. Now, with regards to the single family class that has an inclining block structure, one question might be, how do you arrive at blocks or ranges of usage that you can apply to all customers within that classification? And the typical process that's gone through is a process where we try to understand the common usage characteristics across those customers. And so, for example, for Tier 1 in Tempe, it has been sized based on the census average household, which reflects 2.63 people, as well as a usage assumption per person per day, which is an industry standard number that reflects essentially a survey. Every year, every 10 years is done by the residential end uses of water, so that we can understand what a reasonable assumption for usage would be. And if we take these two numbers and multiply them by one another, we come up with 6,000 gallons of monthly usage would provide for those essential requirements within the average household. Additionally, the next tier, which represents an increment for 6,000 more gallons, reflect a larger household. And so tier 2 reflects essentially the doubling of that census average and the requirements that would be needed to meet that household. And then once we get above those two tiers, which are fundamentally sized to serve typically indoor usage, or in the case of some smaller homes, some outdoor usage, then we really bring into the fold another set of data points that helps us think about what potential seasonal demands are on the system. And so in the particular graphic here, Steve mentioned this a second ago, we looked at the typical lot sizes in Tempe and the large lot sizes in Tempe. And so you can see here I've got highlighted that if we look at the 95th percentile, meaning that all 95% of single family homes are below this level, that's about 16,000 square feet. You can see the vast majority of lot sizes are in this area right here, right around 7,800. So this will be useful when we think about how much potential irrigation is happening on those parcels and what an efficient usage would be. So how do we calculate it? We go through a process of essentially taking the parcel size, in this case 8,000, right near that average, look at the landscape area that's on there using GIS, so we can strip out driveways, hard surface pavers, pools, anything that would not be irrigated, understand what might be irrigated, and then take into account essentially what's provided by the natural environment as far as precipitation, what the requirement of the crops are in the service area, and then what the municipal system would need to make up in order for those crops to be sustained. And that comes up with an allotment for the next tier of about 8,000 gallons for the average lot in Tempe. As a result of the last study, though, we added a tier recognizing the fact that there are a lot of larger lots that have higher irrigation requirements. And so we went through the exact same analysis, but this time upgraded the lot size to that 90th percentile of 16,000 square feet to come up with an additional tier that runs all the way up to 20,000 gallons. And the fifth tier would be all usage up above that. How does this look visually? This graphic right here in the x-axis shows usage levels going up. So this is thousands of gallons going up. This is the amount of volume in total that's contained. And this just shows as you kind of go up in the usage levels that you'll go through these inclining block tiers proportional to the usage level. As a total bill count, you can see there's very few tier 5 bills, but as we go down, tier 4, tier 3, tier 2, and tier 1 actually makes up the largest amount of usage. This is the amount of volume proportionally in the tier, which is very similarly reflective of the bill distribution. And so most single family homes will fall in that average level where we see the peak on this distribution with some tier 1 and tier 2 usage. So with that, I'll conclude these remarks and be more than happy to take any questions or discussion.
Kyle, I see one question from Carmen, but I think I can answer this. So what do you mean with landscaping class? Are these public green areas, landscaping business, or what is it? So the answer is it's a dedicated meter strictly for outdoor use, and that could be from a business, it could be from a multifamily complex, all their outdoor use may be on 1 meter. All of our parks throughout the city have landscaping meters. The difference between a landscaping meter and all the other meters is there's no return flow, there's no connection to the sewer system, and it's strictly for outdoors. So it really could be any customer that has a landscape meter, even potentially a single family customer. If they had a large enough property, they could have their own landscape meter as well. So that's the difference. I'm not seeing any more chat questions as of right now. Oh, one more question from Bob Kawa. How much discretion goes into determining the rate tiers?
So that, Bob, that's a really good question. Really, that is ultimately a function of each community and what you observe relative to usage characteristics and property distributions. But ultimately, that is up to each community in terms of how many tiers they would like to have and what are the sizes of those tiers. But ultimately, you do tend to get into situations where you generally see structures that have, say, 3 to 5 tiers. You often don't see, many systems going above that, and if they do, they really wish they hadn't. So, Kyle, I'm thinking about Purcellville, Virginia. How many tiers did they have?
I believe they had 17. We had downline.
17 tiers, and it was regretful. Washington Sanitary Suburban Commission in DC, they had a significant number of tiers, and it became just too much to manage, and it became too granular from a cost allocation perspective. It was a real challenge. So I think, ultimately, there is discretion there. There's generally, you can see from what we also identified from local practices too, what the typical ranges are, but there is discretion there. We just want to make sure from a cost to service standpoint that we can support establishing prices for the different tiers that we set based upon the contributions to system costs that we can connect to them, and that they're meaningful differentials. We don't want to have too small a tiers, in 1,000-gallon increments that becomes too much to manage. So I think there's some judgment involved, but there is a fair amount of discretion as well.
Could I have a follow-up on that question?
Sure.
So in the different rate structures that have the tier 1 at $1.80, I think it was, and then it goes on from there for the different tiers. How much discretion is there, either by yourselves or by the council, in determining what that cost is at those different tiers?
So ultimately, the process to determine the cost for each tier is really based on what Kyle outlined, which was the base extra capacity approach that has been widely used throughout the water industry for a long period of time and is part of a manual of practice published by the American Waterworks Association. So it's a pretty, I don't want to say standardized, but a very commonly used approach to allocate your cost of functions and then distribute those costs to setting your tier rates. So we would envision, absent direction otherwise, that we continue to follow that type of approach where we assign costs to the tiers using that methodology. So as we change tier sizes, it would change the rates. But ultimately, notwithstanding the analysis that we do to have cost justified rates, ultimately, it's up to the elected officials to adopt rates for the community. The problem is if they do something different than what's cost supported, there is a potential for legal challenge to say, well, you had this study done, it used a industry accepted methodology and approach, it recommended this, and for no good reason, you made an arbitrary decision to set rates here. That would open up the community potentially to a legal challenge for what's oftentimes referred to as, arbitrary and capricious rate setting, which goes against the state statutes. So there's some discretion there to do some things differently, but there's got to be a basis ultimately for whatever decision is made.
Would it be fair? I know in the last 2017 rate hike that a lot of the residents in tier 3, 4, and 5 were thinking that they were being charged higher rates and subsidized in the lower tiers in order to be encouraged, or some would use the word forced, to reduce their water consumption. But is there a subsidy going on with tier, say, 3 and 4 and 5 to the other tiers?
Not in the way that the rates were calculated, because as Kyle described it, we allocated the cost to each tier based upon the contributions and use that we saw from each tier to our maximum day and peak hour demands. And so really the intent was so that you would have a very specific cost basis for the rate in each tier so that you wouldn't have that type of subsidy. The part of the process that we had to make an assumption on last time, as Kyle mentioned, because we didn't have it, was what are the actual peak hour contributions by customer class and by tier. But now that we have the AMI data, that's where we can really enhance the process before that relied on some industry standard assumptions, that we can make that now also be data driven, as was every other element of the tier setting process last time.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir. Steve, did you have other questions that you wanted Kyle or I to address before we moved into the customer impact section?
Oh, yeah, sorry. I was actually just asking one and didn't realize I was on mute. So I think we kind of talked about this, but Cass has asked the question. I'm curious as to why there can't be a tier for single family homes that have acreage. I use very little water in my home comparative to my landscaping needs. And I think that gets back to the fact that the break point between tier 4 and tier 5 is 16,000 square feet. but I'm not sure how much that would impact the cost per tier so much. I mean, even if we added more tier breaks or more tiers, how much that would change as far as what that cost would be. Maybe you could talk about that a bit.
Yeah, I think that tier breaks would just affect the distribution of the cost. So to the extent that, we were to, incorporate an additional tier, Steve, I think then the issue would be when we run the numbers with the AMI data, the usage in each tier, as we regroup it, how much is that contributing to our maximum day and peak hour demands? And so that could, the way we size the tiers could affect the allocation of cost depending upon the usage in those tiers and how it impacts the system on the maximum day and peak hour. So tier sizing could have an impact on the rates per tier as well.
Based on what I'm hearing, though, maybe something we want to look into just to show, okay, what based on our AMI data, if we were to add a tier or two, what that might look like.
Yeah, and that's one of the great points that we can do this year is really amplify the approach used in 2017 with your AMI data. And the way Kyle and Deb set these things up is they're pretty dynamic models. So I think that might be an interesting topic for that that rate design workshop that we'll have, is to maybe not necessarily have it be as much of a kind of just specific PowerPoint, but maybe have a couple of different scenarios we can look at to do just that.
Sounds good. I don't see any other questions.
Okay. So just the last section is just customer impacts and how do we talk about those? They're kind of the key element after we do this analysis and calculate changes, is talking through how this would particularly impact customers. And as we looked at the customer statistics up there a second ago in cost of service, there's a lot of different customers on the system. Single family homes make up a good portion of those customers. So these next few slides, I just wanted to show you how we typically will group up some of these customer impacts and show, and this is just an example of these impacts. And so you can see in this case, kind of thinking about a smaller household with 7,000 gallons of usage, 5,000 on the wastewater, of what that particular change would look like. So as part of this study, we would envision very similar type graphics and updates to try to show how, if we make changes, or as we just discussed, potentially add tiers, different customers with different usage requirements will be affected at different rates. And so this shows, for an example, a customer with this type of proposal would be $1.80 more a month, or 2.7%. Now, as a customer's usage goes up, and we just talked about those tier breakpoints, depending on where those are and what the exact pricing is, these customer impacts will change. And so for this particular one, is a 2-person household with some outdoor use, or potentially that larger family that we just talked about. And in this particular case, we could see a bill change of $2.50 or 33. So the numbers aren't important, but it's really the grouping in the way that we want to talk about these changes and show common example or common representative households within the community. In this particular case right here is an example of a large a household with large significant outdoor seasonal usage. In this particular case, if you had, like we did in 17, a change in the structure that priced it a little bit differently, this household potentially could see a decrease. So we're showing a decrease here of 10% with 50,000 gallons of usage outdoor, 12,000 indoor. And so just helpful to understand what different households may see as far as bill impacts, because as we go through these studies, it's often the case that we'll have varied impacts depending on the exact usage and configuration of the households. Last element I brought in here, and I think, Steve, you mentioned this a second ago, and you might have more detail you want to add to this, but the main thing is that AMI data, not only is it a source for the analysis and the people like me who wake up and live and breathe and love this stuff, but it's also a tool for every user on the system. And Tempe's working on and has this portal where you can essentially look at your usage and also get potential for leak alerts and conservation recommendations. And it just gives an element of feedback that traditionally in the industry we haven't been able to do without this kind of infrastructure. So the last element, and I'll just go through real quick, and then if there's any other final questions, happy to take them or discussion, but just summary of activities and when we'll be getting together. So today we just went through kind of rate 101, which is the general process and group role and desired outcomes. What we'll be doing in these next few ones is really taking a deep dive on each of these topics and bringing the latest and greatest data to the table. So the revenue sufficiency workshop is next week. We've got these models updated, populated, and we want to show you what the current projection is for the needs of the system and the assumptions that we're putting into the forecast, talking about capital investment, O&M, so that we can see if the utilities are similar level of increases are indicated like we did in 17, or what that forecast and that trajectory of rates would look like going forward. We've got the cost of service workshop on 7/7 that will detail the proportionality of cost. And then finally, the rate structure workshop in August 11th to talk about the specific rate structure enhancements and customer impacts.
Hey, Kyle, this is Steve. Cass just asked a great question, and the question was, when you use current data to create the new criteria, are you going to take into account the COVID impacts, such as everybody has been home 24/7 for the past 2 or 3 months, using much more water in our homes than we would normally use? And you can go on this, but from my standpoint, we always look back over the last 3 years, Cass, and it's basically a baseline, if you will. Obviously, we want to take out weather impacts, right? So from one year to the next, we may have some very variable weather that can absolutely affect outdoor usage. And obviously, COVID has a huge reduction in commercial, and that's great for us for a scenario base to kind of predict and or forecast what revenue sufficiency may look like. Say, for instance, if we had a second COVID impact and so forth. But all of those criteria, we want to normalize that, so we're not just basing it off of a very short time period. We actually look over several years. But I'll let Andy and Kyle address that in more detail.
Absolutely, and I think my thoughts on that, Steve, is we get into this data at the detailed level such that we can incorporate the relevant things. And COVID definitely is, and as we pull up that revenue sufficiency analysis, I'm going to want to talk through how we pulled that data that I showed a little bit of it today, and how we've integrated that into your financial model. And I think the only other thing that I would kind of mention is, with utility rate setting and changes, a steady hand approach is often the best. So the year-to-year dynamics can be very volatile. Steve mentioned, weather is a really big one in your particular area. So I know you guys just had some abnormally hot weather, irrigation goes up, revenues come into the system. On opposite years, though, the revenue comes down. And what we try to do is make sure that we're seeing those trends, but we don't want to necessarily make large changes one year to the next for these changes, but rather recognize the long-term trends that are influencing the utility and make adjustments appropriately along the way. And that's part of the reason that we open this up every 2 years to do a deep dive and look at the data and ensure we're on a sustainable path.
All right, I'm not seeing any more questions. Kyle, would you do me a favor and just pull up your previous screen?
Happy to, Steve. There we go.
I know you just referred to this, but I just like to turn it over to Terry now. But I just want to make sure everyone's aware that we have a meeting starting next week, Tuesday next week, same time as this, 9 to 11 a.m. For those who weren't able to attend, I'll be following up through email and sending out a video link. But with that, I'd like to turn it over to our Municipal Utilities Director, Terry.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, everybody. I'll just a quick thank you for everyone for participating and for your thoughtful questions. It's very encouraging that folks are getting engaged right out of the gate, so to speak. We're very much looking forward to the next series of meetings as we move forward through this process. We will work through the technological challenges as we go. We've been texting and talking about getting a conference call line, so if people are without microphones or have other challenges where they can't get the full suite of options on the Teams platform, we'll have another way to be able to communicate, because it's fine to do it via chat, but sometimes it's a little easier to do it verbally. So we will work on that as well, and you'll hear back from us on that. So in the meantime, if there's anything we can do to assist in that regard, you can feel free to reach out to Steve or Laura or anyone on the team for that. And if there are any other questions in general, we'd be glad to answer them. So thank you again.